The phone rang on a quiet Sunday afternoon. My mother answered it with the same calm voice everyone in our town trusted. But less than 3 minutes later, her face went pale. She sat down slowly, like her legs could no longer hold her. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. That single phone call didn't just expose my sister's lies. It destroyed my mother's reputation, a reputation she had spent decades protecting, by sacrificing the truth and by sacrificing me. For years, people said my mother was a saint, a devoted parent, a woman who would do anything for her children. And they were right. She would do anything, even protect lies she knew were false, even if it meant letting one child carry the blame, so the other could stay clean. I grew up watching my sister cry her way out of trouble, watching my mother stand in front of her like a shield, and watching myself slowly disappear in the background. Every lie followed the same pattern. My sister spoke, my mother believed her, and I learned to stay quiet. At first, I thought my mother was fooled, that she simply didn't know the truth. But one night, years later, she admitted something that changed everything. She looked at me and said, "I know your sister lies, but if I don't protect her, this family will fall apart." That was the moment I realized something painful. My mother wasn't choosing peace. She was choosing appearances. And I was the price. What people didn't see was how those lies grew, how protecting small deceptions made room for bigger ones, and how my mother's silence slowly became a habit she could no longer control. By the time the truth reached beyond our family, it was already too late. That phone call came from someone my mother never expected, someone she thought had forgotten, someone who remembered everything. And when the truth was finally spoken out loud, it wasn't anger that destroyed her image. It was confirmation. If you've ever been the child who stayed quiet to keep the peace, if you've ever watched a parent defend the wrong person just to avoid shame, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. And before we continue, if stories about family betrayal, hidden truth, and quiet karma speak to you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. That way, even if life pulls you away before this story ends, you'll always be able to come back, and you won't miss the powerful stories waiting for you here. Now here's the question I want you to think about as we continue. What happens when a parent protects lies for so long that the truth no longer needs revenge? Because the most shocking part of this story isn't the phone call itself. It's what came after, and the one thing my mother never expected, even at her lowest point. Stay with me. I don't remember the first time my mother chose my sister over me. Not because it didn't matter, but because it happened so often, it slowly became normal. Growing up, we were an ordinary family in a quiet American suburb. Nothing dramatic on the surface. A small house, a neat yard, neighbors who waved and smiled. From the outside, we looked like a family that had everything together. My sister was 2 years older than me. She was charming in a way that made adults lean closer when she spoke. She knew how to cry at the right moment, how to lower her voice, how to sound hurt, even when she wasn't. People believed her easily. I was the opposite, quiet, careful with words. I didn't interrupt. I didn't perform. I assumed that if I told the truth calmly, it would be enough. I was wrong. The first memories I have aren't of big arguments. They're small moments. Missing money from my mother's purse, a broken lamp in the living room, a teacher calling home about something that went wrong at school. Every time my sister had an explanation ready, and every time my mother turned to me with the same look, not anger, not disappointment, something worse, expectation. She expected me to understand, to accept it, to stay quiet. When I tried to speak up, My mother would raise her hand slightly, not to silence me, just enough to pause me, and she would say, "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." That sentence followed me through my childhood. When my sister blamed me for things she did, my mother rarely asked questions. She didn't check timelines. She didn't look for patterns. She listened. She nodded. And then she decided. Later, when we were alone, my mother would say things like, "You know how sensitive your sister is," or "She's been under a lot of pressure." I learned early that my feelings were negotiable. Hers were not. At school, teachers liked my sister. She volunteered. She smiled. She cried when she needed sympathy. When trouble followed her, it somehow landed on me instead. One afternoon, I was called into the principal's office. My sister had accused me of something I didn't do. When we got home, my mother sat us down at the kitchen table. She didn't ask me what happened. She asked my sister if she was okay. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not hatred, just a quiet understanding. I was not the child my mother worried about. I was the child she assumed would endure. As the years passed, this pattern deepened. Family gatherings, school events, small conflicts that always ended the same way. My sister needed protection, and I needed to be patient. When relatives questioned things, my mother smiled and said, "Kids will be kids." When neighbors whispered, she defended my sister without hesitation. And when I finally asked her carefully, gently, "Why do you always believe her?" my mother sighed and said, "Because I need this family to stay peaceful." That word stayed with me, peaceful. What she meant was quiet, predictable, presentable. I learned to stop explaining. I learned to stop expecting fairness. And slowly, I learned that in our family, truth mattered less than harmony, at least the kind of harmony my mother wanted. By the time I was a teenager, I wasn't angry anymore. I was numb. I stayed in my room. I stayed out of conversations. I stayed invisible. And my mother seemed relieved by that. She would say things like, "You're so mature for your age. You don't cause problems." What she didn't realize was that her relief was built on silence. And silence, when protected long enough, turns into something dangerous. At the time, I didn't know where this path would lead. I only knew one thing for certain. My mother wasn't choosing between right and wrong. She was choosing between comfort and truth. And from that moment on, the lies stopped being accidents. The first lie that truly changed something didn't happen at home. It happened outside our family. And that's why it mattered. By the time my sister was in high school, she had learned something important. Lies worked better when there were witnesses. When teachers, friends, or neighbors were involved, her stories sounded more convincing. And my mother became her strongest ally. It started with a problem at school. Something went missing. Money that had been collected for an event. Nothing dramatic at first. Just enough to raise questions. My sister came home crying. She said someone was accusing her unfairly. She said she felt humiliated. She said she didn't know why people were being so cruel. My mother didn't ask what really happened. She hugged her. She told her everything would be okay. And then she turned to me. She asked if I had been near the money. She didn't accuse me directly. She didn't have to. The question itself said enough. I told her the truth. I explained where I had been. I spoke carefully, like I always did. But my sister was already crying harder, and my mother was already deciding. The next day, my mother went to the school. She spoke calmly. She spoke confidently. She defended my sister with facts that weren't facts, with certainty that wasn't earned. When she came home, she told me the issue was resolved, but something else had happened. Teachers started watching me differently. Friends became distant. People didn't say anything outright. They didn't need to. I was marked. One evening, I asked my mother why she hadn't told the school the whole story. She looked tired. Not angry, just tired. She said, "If I tell them the truth, your sister's future will be damaged." Then she paused, "And you'll be fine." That was the first time she said it out loud. Not as comfort, as a conclusion. I realized in that moment that my role in the family was clear. I was the one who could afford to lose my reputation, my voice, my place. Weeks later, a woman from the school called our house. She asked to speak to my mother privately. I heard my mother's voice change during that call. Quieter, more cautious. After she hung up, she didn't look at me. She didn't sit down. She just stood there, holding the phone. She knew. Someone had told her what really happened. Someone had seen my sister take the money. And for a brief moment, I thought things might change. They didn't. That night, my mother came into my room. She sat on the edge of my bed. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She said, "I need you to let this go." I asked her if she believed me now. She nodded slowly. Then she said something I would never forget. "I've always known you tell the truth." That sentence should have felt like justice. Instead, it felt like betrayal. Because if she knew, then every time she chose my sister, it wasn't confusion. It was strategy. She told me that families survive by protecting their weakest members, that my sister couldn't handle consequences the way I could, that sometimes parents had to make hard choices. I wanted to ask her why the hard choices always landed on me. But I didn't. I already knew the answer. From that point on, lying stopped feeling accidental. It became intentional, organized, protected. My sister grew bolder. She learned that tears were currency, and my mother kept paying. And I learned something else. Silence wasn't just expected of me. It was required, because every time the truth surfaced, my mother didn't ask how to fix it. She asked how to hide it. And that was the moment the lies stopped being small. By the time my sister reached adulthood, lying wasn't something she did anymore. It was who she was. She learned how to tell stories that sounded sincere. Stories with just enough truth to feel real. And when questions appeared, my mother was already there, smoothing the edges. College applications were the first big test. My sister needed recommendations. She needed explanations for gaps and mistakes. And she needed someone to confirm her version of events. My mother did all of that, without hesitation. When a counselor asked about disciplinary issues, my mother framed them as misunderstandings. When grades were questioned, she blamed stress. When character was discussed, she spoke about resilience and growth. No one ever called me for my version. I watched my sister pack for school with confidence. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid of being exposed. She had never been held accountable before. After she left the house, felt quieter, not peaceful, empty. My mother told me I should be happy for her. She said she deserves a fresh start. I didn't argue. I had learned that arguing only reminded my mother of problems she didn't want to see. While my sister built a life based on stories, I stayed behind and worked. Part-time jobs, late shifts, saving money quietly. When relatives asked why I wasn't in college, yet my mother answered for me. She said I needed time. She said I wasn't ready. What she didn't say was that our resources had already been allocated. Time, money, energy. They all went in one direction. During holidays, my sister came home with new stories, new achievements, new struggles that somehow weren't her fault. She always needed something. More money, more understanding, more protection. And my mother always found a way to provide it. One night, after my sister had gone out, my mother poured herself a drink and sat at the kitchen table. She looked older than I remembered. Tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. She told me she was worried, that my sister made impulsive choices, that she didn't always tell the truth. I waited. I didn't interrupt. Then my mother said, "But she needs me." That was when I asked a question I had been carrying for years. "What about me?" My mother didn't answer right away. She stared at the table. Then she said something quietly, almost defensively. "You're strong. You always have been." In her mind, that was enough. Not long after that conversation, my sister was involved in a serious incident. Details were vague, stories changed, but one thing was clear: someone else was being blamed. My mother received a call late at night. I heard her pacing. I heard her lower her voice. I heard her say my sister's name over and over. The next morning, she sat me down. She didn't explain what happened. She didn't ask for my side. She asked me for something else. She asked me to promise that if anyone ever came to me with questions, I would say nothing. She said it wasn't lying. It was protecting family. I looked at her and realized something painful. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about control. She was managing a story, and I was being written out of it. A few months later, I made my decision. Not out of anger, out of survival. I moved out quietly. No argument, no confrontation. Just a suitcase and a plan. My mother didn't try to stop me. She told me she was proud of me for being independent. She said I was doing the right thing. What she didn't say was that my absence made things easier. Fewer questions, fewer risks. As I stood in the doorway that last morning, I realized something that would take years to accept. My mother wasn't afraid of my sister's lies. She was afraid of the truth, changing how people saw her. And from that moment on, my silence became part of her reputation. After I moved out, my life became quieter in ways I hadn't expected. Not easier, just quieter. I worked. I paid my bills. I kept to myself. And slowly, I began to understand how much energy I had spent trying not to disturb my family's balance. Meanwhile, my mother's life went in the opposite direction. From the outside, she thrived. She became more involved in the community. She volunteered. She organized events. People sought her advice. They spoke about her with admiration. She's such a strong mother. She's been through so much. She's held that family together. I heard these things secondhand, from relatives, from neighbors who ran into me at the grocery store. They smiled when they spoke her name. I smiled back. What they didn't see was how much of that image was built on what never got said, on the stories that ended early, on the questions no one followed up on. My sister's life continued in waves. Jobs that didn't last, relationships that ended suddenly, situations that always had someone else to blame. Each time something went wrong, my mother stepped in, sometimes with money, sometimes with explanations, sometimes with carefully chosen words that redirected attention. I learned to recognize those words. She's been struggling. She didn't mean it that way. She's learning. The truth was always nearby, but it never crossed the line into daylight. I visited less often, not because I didn't care, but because being there meant watching the same performance repeat. Whenever I did come by, my mother acted relieved. She cooked my favorite meals. She asked polite questions about my job. She avoided anything that might pull us back into old territory. Once during a holiday dinner, a distant relative asked about an incident involving my sister. It was the kind of question that sounded innocent, but wasn't. The table went quiet. My mother smiled gently and said, "That was all a misunderstanding." No one pushed further. Later that night, she pulled me aside and said, "Thank you for not saying anything." That was the moment I understood how deeply involved I still was. Even in silence, I was participating. As years passed, my mother's reputation became something she guarded carefully. She dressed for it. She spoke for it. She made decisions with it in mind. She wasn't protecting my sister anymore. She was protecting a version of herself. I started noticing patterns that went beyond our family. People in the community would confide in my mother. They trusted her judgment. They assumed her honesty. Sometimes I watched her advise others in ways that sounded generous, but I noticed what she left out, what she softened, what she redirected. She was skilled at shaping narratives, not with lies, with omissions. The realization came slowly, and then all at once. This wasn't about love overpowering reason. It was about control overpowering accountability. One afternoon, a former coworker of my sister contacted me. They spoke carefully. They asked questions without asking. I didn't answer. I told them I wasn't involved. But after that conversation, something unsettled me, because it was clear that my mother's silence had reached further than I thought. She wasn't just managing our family history. She was influencing how others understood events that affected them too. When I brought this up gently, my mother brushed it off. She said, "People exaggerated." She said it wasn't our responsibility to correct every rumor. But the way she said it made something clear. She didn't see silence as avoidance. She saw it as authority. By the time I left that day, I understood something that would later matter more than I realized. Reputations don't collapse because of lies alone. They collapse because of the truth that waits patiently underneath. And my mother had spent years stacking silence on top of silence, never imagining how heavy it had become. She believed control would keep everything intact. She never considered what would happen when someone else decided to speak. There is a point where protecting someone stops being loyalty and starts becoming participation. I didn't know when my mother crossed that line, only that by the time I saw it, clearly we were already far past it. My sister's problems were no longer private. They involved money, promises, people who expected accountability. She had entered a business arrangement with someone outside our family. The details were vague, constantly shifting. But one thing was consistent. When things went wrong, it was never her fault. At first, my mother said she didn't want to get involved. She said my sister was an adult now, that she needed to handle her own consequences. That lasted exactly one phone call. After that call, my mother became quiet, focused. She started making arrangements. She asked questions that weren't about what happened. They were about who knew, what could be proven, what could be denied. I recognized that tone. I had heard it before. The person my sister had hurt reached out to me. Not angrily, carefully. They didn't accuse. They asked if my sister had a pattern, if my mother was aware. I told them the truth in the safest way I could. I said my mother knew more than she admitted. I said she had always protected my sister. There was a pause on the line. Then the person said something that stayed with me. So she knows, and she still lets this happen. That question sat heavy in my chest. When my mother found out I had spoken to someone, she didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She looked at me like I had betrayed her. She said, "You don't understand what's at stake." I asked her what that was. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "My reputation." She didn't say my sister's future. She didn't say our family's safety. She said reputation. That was when I realized this wasn't damage control. It was image management. My mother contacted the person my sister had wronged. She spoke on my sister's behalf. She offered explanations. She implied misunderstandings. And when that didn't work, she suggested that the other person had misinterpreted things. The tone shifted. What had once been quiet protection became active denial. I asked my mother if she understood what this was doing to others. She said, "Everyone makes mistakes." She said people should be more forgiving, but forgiveness requires truth, and truth was the one thing she refused to offer. The situation escalated. Legal language entered the conversation. Documents, deadlines. My sister panicked. She stopped answering calls. She avoided responsibility. And my mother stepped forward. She believed that if she stood firm long enough, the problem would disappear. What she didn't realize was that someone was paying attention. Someone who had been patient. Someone who had saved everything. Messages, receipts, voicemails. I didn't know who this person was yet, only that they existed. The day my mother decided to fully protect my sister, one last time, I felt something shift. Not fear, certainty. I told my mother that this wouldn't end the way she thought it would. She told me I was being dramatic. She said she had handled worse. That night, I couldn't sleep because for the first time, I understood the scale of what had been built. Years of silence, years of redirection, years of choosing comfort over truth, all stacked together. And somewhere out there, someone was holding the one thing my mother couldn't control, the truth. They just hadn't used it yet. The phone call came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of afternoon my mother liked best. Quiet, predictable, safe. She had just finished lunch. The house was clean. The television was on, but muted. Everything was exactly the way she liked it. When the phone rang, she answered without hesitation. Her voice was warm, polite, the voice people trusted. At first, nothing seemed wrong. I was in the room sorting through old paperwork, half listening. My mother said hello. She said yes. She laughed softly the way she did when she wanted to sound relaxed. Then something changed. Her posture stiffened. Her smile disappeared. She stopped pacing and sat down slowly, like her body had made the decision for her. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was different. Lower, careful. She asked one question, then another. I couldn't hear the other side of the call, but I could tell this wasn't a conversation. It was a statement being delivered. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her eyes fixed on the floor. And for the first time, I could remember my mother didn't seem in control. After a few minutes, she said, "I need to think about this." There was a pause. Then she said, "I understand." And the call ended. She stayed seated holding the phone long after the line went dead. She didn't look at me. She didn't say my name. I waited. Finally, she stood up and walked to the window. Her reflection stared back at her, and she didn't recognize it. I asked who it was. She didn't answer. I asked if everything was okay. She said they have evidence. That was all. Not accusations, not anger. Evidence. The person who called wasn't emotional. They weren't asking for explanations. They weren't looking for apologies. They were informing her. They knew exactly what had happened. They knew when it started. They knew how long it had been covered up. And they knew my mother's role in it. What my mother didn't understand was how visible her silence had become. She had believed that by not lying outright, she was protecting herself. She was wrong. The caller had records. Messages where my mother redirected blame. Voicemails where she minimized harm. Emails where she framed lies as misunderstandings. All of it painted the same picture, not of a confused parent, but of a willing protector. My mother finally turned to me and said something I had never heard before. "Do you think they'll believe me?" I didn't answer right away, because for once, the question wasn't about belief. It was about timing. The caller had already contacted others, people in the community, people who respected my mother, people who had defended her in the past. And now they were asking questions my mother couldn't redirect. She began making calls, carefully chosen ones, trying to get ahead of the story. But the tone had changed. People listened. Then they paused. They didn't offer reassurance. They said things like, "I need to look into this. I wasn't aware of that." Someone else mentioned something similar. Each sentence landed like weight. By the end of the day, my mother's phone stopped ringing. Not because the situation was resolved, but because the narrative had shifted. She sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at nothing. The confidence that had carried her for years was gone. She whispered, "I was just trying to keep things together." I believed her, but intentions don't erase impact. And protecting lies doesn't preserve peace. It only delays consequences. That phone call didn't expose my sister first. It exposed my mother. And as the truth began moving on its own, I realized something quietly, without satisfaction or relief. This wasn't revenge. This was what happens when silence runs out of space to hide. The change didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, uncomfortable moments. People who used to call my mother for advice stopped calling. Messages went unanswered. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that people were confused, that once she explained everything would return to normal. But explanations require trust, and trust had already begun to slip. My sister didn't handle it well. She avoided the house. She stopped answering my mother's calls. When she did show up, she was defensive and angry. She said people were overreacting. She said someone was trying to ruin her. She said my mother needed to fix this. And my mother tried. She reached out to community leaders. She tried to frame the situation as exaggerated. She said she had only been trying to help. Some people listened politely. Others didn't. Whispers replaced conversations. Glances replaced smiles. The version of my mother that everyone admired no longer matched the information they were receiving. Eventually, someone asked me directly. We were standing outside a local event, the kind my mother used to organize. They didn't accuse me. They didn't confront me. They simply asked, "Is any of this true?" I felt the weight of that moment. Years of silence pressed against my chest. Before I could answer, my mother stepped in. She laughed lightly and said, "You know how stories get twisted." Then she looked at me, not pleading, not apologetic, warning. She said my other child has always had a complicated relationship with the truth. It took me a moment to understand what she had done. She had shifted the focus, placed doubt where certainty threatened her. And for the first time, she did it publicly. The room felt smaller. People exchanged looks. I realized then that this was her instinct under pressure. When control slipped, she redirected. After that night, things escalated quickly. People who had stayed neutral began to distance themselves. Not out of anger, out of uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous for someone whose identity relies on being trusted. My mother grew defensive. She spoke less kindly. She became rigid in her explanations. The warmth that once defined her image was replaced by urgency. One evening, she called me and asked me to come over. Her voice sounded tight. When I arrived, she didn't offer food. She didn't sit down. She told me I needed to help her. She said people were asking questions, that my silence was being interpreted as agreement. She wanted me to deny everything, to say I had been mistaken, to say I misunderstood her intentions. I asked her if she realized what she was asking. She said, "This is about survival." I asked whose. She didn't answer. Then she said something that hurt more than I expected. She said, "If you love this family, you wouldn't let it fall apart over misunderstandings." In that moment, I saw her clearly, not as a villain, not as a hero, as a woman who had confused control with care for so long that she no longer knew the difference. My sister called later that night. She was crying. She said everything was spiraling. She asked why I hadn't stopped this. I told her something I had never said before. I didn't start it. She hung up. By the end of that week, my mother's name carried a pause after it. People hesitated before speaking it. They chose their words carefully. And I understood something important. When a mask falls, it's not because someone pulls it away. It's because holding it up finally becomes too exhausting. And my mother was tired. I didn't plan to speak, not because I was afraid, but because I had spent so many years learning how not to. The moment came quietly. No stage, no raised voices, just a small group of people who had known my family for years. They didn't ask me to explain everything. They asked me one simple question. How long has this been going on? I took a breath. And for the first time, I didn't measure my words to protect anyone else. I told them the truth. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. I spoke the way I always had. Carefully. Clearly. I told them my sister had lied for years. That she wasn't confused or misunderstood. She was practiced. I told them my mother knew. Not sometimes. Not recently. From the beginning. There was no shock in the room. No gasps. Just stillness. One of them said quietly, "So your mother knew all along." That was the moment everything shifted, because the story they had been trying to understand was never really about my sister. It was about permission. My sister had been protected, yes, but my mother had been the one setting the rules. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand accountability. I didn't list every incident. I didn't need to. The truth, once spoken plainly, has a way of organizing itself. Someone asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I answered honestly, because every time I tried, I was told it would hurt the family. Another person asked if my mother ever admitted it. I said she had. Privately. More than once. And that was when the disappointment set in. Not toward my sister. Toward my mother. People don't expect perfection from parents. But they do expect integrity. When my mother found out I had spoken, she didn't confront me right away. She sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, "I thought you would protect me." I looked at her and realized how deeply the roles had reversed. For years, I had protected her image by staying quiet, and she had called that love. I told her something calmly, without anger. "I protected you by carrying the truth alone. I won't do that anymore." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just looked smaller. My sister reacted differently. She accused me of betrayal. She said I had ruined everything. She said I could have handled it privately. I reminded her that nothing about this had ever been private. It had simply been hidden. The community response wasn't loud. There were no public confrontations, just distance. People stopped defending my mother. They stopped explaining things away for her. Some reached out quietly to say they were sorry. Others said nothing at all. But the most surprising part came later. Someone told me they weren't shocked by the truth. They said they had sensed something was wrong for years. What they struggled with was knowing my mother had chosen silence over honesty again and again. That knowledge changed how they saw her. Not cruelly, just clearly. And in that clarity, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because anyone lost their reputation, but because I no longer had to carry the weight of it. For the first time, the truth didn't belong only to me. And that made all the difference. Nothing collapsed overnight. There was no single moment where everything fell apart. What happened instead was quieter, slower, more final. My mother didn't lose her job. She wasn't publicly shamed. No one confronted her angrily. What she lost was something she had relied on for most of her life. Credibility. People still greeted her politely. They still smiled when they passed her in the street. But the warmth was gone. Conversations stayed shallow. Trust stayed guarded. She was no longer the person people went to for guidance. No longer the voice others leaned on when things became difficult. And my sister felt it too. Without my mother's protection, things didn't magically improve. They stalled. Opportunities stopped coming easily. People asked more questions. Stories were met with silence instead of sympathy. For the first time, my sister had to stand alone with her choices. And she didn't know how. She tried to reach out to me again. Not to apologize, but to explain. She said she never meant for things to get this bad. She said she thought someone would always fix it. I listened. I didn't argue. I simply told her the truth. No one can fix what you won't face. She didn't respond. My relationship with my mother changed in ways I hadn't expected. We still spoke, but carefully. She no longer asked me to protect her, and I no longer volunteered to. Once, months later, she admitted something quietly. She said, "I thought if I kept things under control, no one would get hurt." I didn't challenge her. I didn't correct her, because the truth was already visible. Control hadn't prevented harm. It had delayed accountability. And delay has a cost. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel satisfied. What I felt was distance, the kind that allows you to breathe again. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, stopped wondering what I could have done differently. For the first time, my peace wasn't dependent on anyone else's silence. That was my karma. Not revenge, not punishment. Freedom. My mother still believes she acted out of love, and maybe in her own way, she did. But love without honesty becomes fear, and fear builds systems that eventually collapse under their own weight. I didn't destroy my mother's reputation. I didn't expose her publicly. I simply stopped carrying what was never mine to hold. And when the truth stands on its own, it doesn't need force. It just needs time. If you're listening to this, and you recognize yourself in this story, maybe as the quiet one, maybe as the one expected to endure, know this. You don't owe anyone your silence, and you don't need to hurt others to heal yourself. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step aside and let the truth breathe. Because karma doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. And clarity, once it comes, changes everything. As someone who has spent many years listening to family stories like this, I want to say something important before we end. Most parents who protect a child's lies don't believe they are doing harm. They tell themselves they are preventing damage. They believe silence will keep the family intact. But what they often don't see is that silence doesn't erase consequences. It only moves them forward in time. When one child is protected at all costs, another child learns that love is conditional, that truth is negotiable, and that their role is to endure. Over time, this creates an invisible imbalance, not just between siblings, but inside the parent as well. The parent begins to identify with the image they've built, the protector, the stabilizer, the one who holds everything together. And once identity becomes tied to reputation, truth starts to feel dangerous. That's when control replaces care. What happened in this story wasn't sudden betrayal. It was the natural result of years of unspoken agreements. Agreements that said, peace matters more than honesty, that appearances matter more than accountability. Karma in real life rarely looks dramatic. It doesn't arrive with shouting or revenge. More often, it arrives quietly, as distance, as loss of trust, as people seeing clearly for the first time. And healing doesn't come from exposing others. It comes from releasing what was never yours to carry. If you are the one who stayed silent, who was told to be strong, who was asked to protect the family by disappearing inside, please hear this. Your voice matters, even if you choose not to use it publicly, even if you choose peace over confrontation. Healing begins the moment you stop sacrificing yourself to maintain someone else's image. And if you are a parent listening to this, remember this one truth. Protecting a child from consequences does not protect them from life. It only delays the lesson. If this story resonated with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see your own experience more clearly, please take a moment to like this video and consider subscribing to this channel. Here we share stories, not to create anger, but to create awareness, not to encourage revenge, but to remind us that truth, compassion, and boundaries can coexist. Your support helps these stories reach others who may still believe they are alone in their silence. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember this, you don't need to destroy anyone to reclaim yourself. Sometimes letting go is the most powerful form of justice there is.